It was a quiet Thursday evening in the city, and the upscale restaurant was filled with the soft hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the gentle sound of background music. The place had a warm glow, with chandeliers casting delicate reflections on polished tables. Waitresses moved gracefully between tables, balancing trays with practiced ease, their faces calm despite the occasional rush from a last-minute reservation or a large party arriving unexpectedly. Among them was a young waitress who had been working at the restaurant for over 2 years. She was not loud or flashy. She didn't draw attention to herself, and most customers barely noticed her as she moved quietly from one table to the next. She had a gentle smile, a polite tone, and a work ethic that kept the restaurant running smoothly behind the scenes. Many of her coworkers admired her, not for any dramatic reason, but for her consistency and the kindness she showed to everyone, from guests to staff. That evening, the restaurant had a few regulars who always came in around this time. Their orders were predictable, and the staff had memorized them. But on this particular evening, a new group entered. They were a mix of middle-aged and older individuals, dressed in suits and designer clothes. Their presence instantly changed the atmosphere in the restaurant. Conversations dimmed slightly as other diners glanced toward them, noticing the expensive watches, polished shoes, and confident air. Leading the group was a man whose aura demanded attention. He carried himself with the self-assuredness of someone used to being in control of rooms and people alike. When he walked, his movements were precise, as though the space around him obeyed his will. His friends followed him, chatting among themselves, laughing occasionally in a way that drew more attention than they realized. The young waitress was assigned to this table. She approached with her usual composure, offering the menus with a smile and taking their initial drink orders. She noticed immediately that the man in charge, clearly the leader, was not just wealthy in appearance, but he seemed to enjoy asserting power in subtle ways. He was charming when he wanted to be, but there was an edge to his demeanor, a teasing, slightly cruel streak that made it clear he enjoyed seeing others flustered. As she poured water and took orders for appetizers, he leaned back in his chair and studied her quietly, a faint smirk appearing on his face. He seemed intrigued, though she couldn't quite tell why at first. The restaurant had a piano in the corner, an elegant upright with a polished black finish. It was more of a decoration than a functional part of the dining experience. Occasionally, a pianist would come in to play softly in the evenings, but tonight there was no music, and the piano sat silent. The man's eyes flicked toward it, and a mischievous thought seemed to take shape. He turned to his friends with a grin. "Do you see that piano over there?" he said, nodding toward the instrument. His friends followed his gaze, some nodding, some laughing quietly. "I wonder if anyone here can play it." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and called the waitress over. "Come here for a moment," he said. His tone was light, almost playful, but there was no mistaking the command in it. The young waitress approached slowly, keeping her head down slightly, unsure what he wanted. She was polite, always willing to assist, but the way he was looking at her made her uneasy. "Can you play the piano?" he asked, his voice filled with amusement. It wasn't a genuine question. It was the kind of question that assumed the answer would be no. His friends laughed before she could even respond, clearly expecting some kind of awkward refusal or embarrassed reaction. She paused, hesitating. I don't really perform," she said softly, her voice calm but firm. The man's smile widened. "Oh, come on, don't be shy. Just a little something for us. It'll be fun." His eyes sparkled with amusement, and he waved a hand toward the piano as if presenting a prize or a challenge. The friends laughed again, some nudging each other, already imagining the scene they expected, the quiet waitress fumbling with the keys, blushing, and retreating with an awkward laugh. She looked toward the piano. a sense of nervousness rising in her chest. She hadn't played in years, at least not publicly. Her skills had mostly been a private part of her life, something she indulged in when the world wasn't watching. But now, the spotlight was on her, whether she liked it or not. She could feel the eyes of everyone at the table, and some of the other diners had started to glance over as well, curiosity pulling them toward the corner where the piano sat. "I really don't want to," she said again, a little more firmly this time, hoping he would let it go. But he didn't. "Nonsense," he said, leaning back and spreading his hands theatrically. "We insist. Don't be modest. Let us see what you've got." His voice carried an edge now, less playful and more commanding. The laughter of his friends filled the air, almost daring her to refuse. The pressure in the room grew, and she could feel her pulse quicken. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had faced difficult situations before, but this was different. There was a mix of embarrassment, anxiety, and curiosity swirling inside her. Finally, she nodded slowly, walking toward the piano. The movement was deliberate. She didn't rush, and she didn't falter, but each step felt heavier than the last. Her hands trembled slightly, though she managed to keep her composure. When she reached the piano, she paused, letting her eyes briefly scan the polished keys. They gleamed under the soft lights of the restaurant. She sat on the bench, adjusting her posture instinctively. She placed her fingers lightly on the keys, letting them hover just above the surface. The room seemed to hold its breath. Some guests leaned forward slightly, intrigued. Others exchanged curious glances, wondering what would happen next. Even some of the staff, who had been busy with their own tables, had stopped for a moment, sensing that something unusual was about to unfold. The man watched her closely, his expression one of smug anticipation. He fully expected her to fumble, perhaps hit a few wrong notes, and retreat quickly, leaving him and his friends in laughter. He tapped his fingers lightly on the table, a subtle drum roll in patience. "Go on, then," he said. "Show us what you've got." His friends chuckled quietly, some whispering guesses about how long it would take for her to fail. The young waitress closed her eyes for a brief moment, centering herself. She remembered the countless hours she had spent playing in private, the times she had lost herself in music without anyone watching. She remembered the joy and the calm it brought her, and in that brief instant, a small spark of confidence appeared. It was a fragile thing, but it was enough to steady her hands. She opened her eyes and looked at the keys with quiet determination. Then she pressed the first note. It was soft, almost hesitant, but perfectly in tune. The sound filled the corner of the restaurant, and for a brief moment, no one spoke. Even the man seemed caught off guard. The note was clear and melodic, carrying a subtle emotion that seemed to surprise everyone. She continued, moving her fingers across the keys with a smooth, confident touch. The melody she played was simple at first, gentle, almost like a whisper, but it had a presence that made the air in the room shift. People started to stop what they were doing. Diners paused mid-conversation, forks hovering above plates. Some leaned forward slightly, drawn by the unexpected music. The waiters and waitresses nearby exchanged astonished glances. It was clear that what was happening was not ordinary. The quiet girl who had been so unassuming just moments ago was producing music that was delicate, yet full of emotion, capturing the attention of everyone in the room. The man's smirk faltered. He had expected embarrassment, and instead he was confronted with skill. He leaned back in his chair, trying to mask his surprise with a casual gesture, but his eyes betrayed him. His friends were silent now, unable to laugh, unsure how to react. The atmosphere had changed completely. What was meant to be a joke had turned into a moment of awe. The young waitress's confidence grew with each note. She didn't rush or hesitate. Her hands moved naturally, guided by muscle memory and years of private practice. The melody became richer, flowing smoothly from one phrase to another. Each note seemed intentional, full of life and emotion. It was as though she had become a conduit for something greater, something that captured the attention and hearts of everyone present. The first part of her performance lasted only a few minutes, but it felt longer to those watching. Every sound she made seemed deliberate, every pause meaningful. The restaurant had transformed from a place of casual dining into a small concert hall. Even the soft background lights seemed to accentuate her presence. Patrons who had been indifferent before were now leaning toward the music, captivated by the unexpected talent before them. The man who had called her over felt a mix of embarrassment and amazement. He had tried to play the situation for laughs, but now he was forced to confront the reality that he had underestimated someone based on her quiet demeanor. He shifted in his chair, trying to regain some composure, but he couldn't deny the truth unfolding in front of him. The waitress, once invisible in the background, had become the center of attention, commanding respect and admiration without saying a word. By the time she ended the first simple piece, the room remained silent for a few moments, as if no one wanted to break the spell. She looked up briefly, her eyes meet. The evening continued in the restaurant, but the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The quiet hum of conversation that had filled the room now carried an undercurrent of curiosity and anticipation. Guests who had been absorbed in their meals or casual talk now occasionally glanced toward the piano, their eyes reflecting the wonder and surprise of what had just occurred. The young waitress moved among the tables, her calm exterior hiding a flutter of emotions inside. She was relieved that the first piece went smoothly, but she also felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement. She hadn't expected to draw so much attention, and while she was proud of what she had done, she wasn't sure how to handle the sudden recognition. Back at the table, the wealthy man who had prompted her to play sat in a state of quiet reflection. His friends, who had initially laughed and expected entertainment at her expense, were now silent, exchanging subtle looks of disbelief. The smirk that had characterized his expression earlier had faded, replaced by an unspoken acknowledgement that he had misjudged the young woman completely. He shifted in his chair, fingers tapping lightly against the table, as if trying to come up with a clever remark to regain control of the situation. But the words didn't come easily, and the laughter that had once filled the table was replaced by a more subdued tone. The waitress returned to the table to clear, empty glasses and check if anything else was needed. She moved with the same grace she always had, but this time the weight of attention made each step feel heavier. She kept her smile soft and polite, trying to maintain professionalism even as the whispers and occasional glances followed her every movement. The man waved her over again, this time more carefully, his tone a mixture of amusement and curiosity. "You know," he said, leaning back slightly in his chair, "that was impressive." His voice lacked the mocking edge from earlier, replaced with a tentative admiration. "I didn't think anyone could play like that, especially someone who just happens to be serving us dinner." His friends nodded quietly, their earlier laughter replaced by genuine appreciation. Some of them even offered compliments, though awkwardly, unsure of how to express respect without breaking the lingering tension. The waitress hesitated before responding, choosing her words carefully. "Thank you," she said softly. I play sometimes. I haven't performed for anyone in a long time." There was a pause, a brief moment where the energy in the room seemed to shift again. The man leaned forward, his fingers steepled on the table, studying her face intently. "Well, you have a gift," he said, almost to himself. "A real talent." There was a subtle change in his demeanor now. The teasing, playful side that had dominated his earlier attitude had vanished. He wasn't trying to impress anyone or provoke a reaction. He was genuinely intrigued, and perhaps for the first time that evening. Slightly humbled by the presence of someone whose skill surpassed his expectations. Despite the compliment, the waitress felt a flicker of unease. She wasn't used to receiving attention in this way, especially from people who seemed so powerful and confident. Her life had been a mix of work, modest ambitions, and quiet dreams. Performing publicly wasn't something she had considered recently. The piano had been a private sanctuary, a place to escape and express herself without judgment. Now, in the presence of strangers who had seen her as a curiosity or a source of amusement, she felt the vulnerability of showing her true abilities. The man seemed to sense this hesitation. He leaned back in his chair, his expression softening further. "I don't want you to feel pressured," he said carefully. "It's just, I've never seen someone like you. That music, it's special." His words were sincere, lacking any trace of the joking tone from earlier. He glanced at his friends, who nodded in agreement. The room, though still filled with diners, seemed to hold its breath once more. The subtle shift in the man's attitude was noticeable, even to the other guests, who sensed that something unique had occurred, and that the dynamic at this table was no longer the same as it had been before. Encouraged by the gentleness in his voice, the waitress took another breath and spoke more freely. I used to take lessons when I was younger, but life got busy, and I stopped performing. I didn't think anyone would notice if I kept playing in private." Her hands brushed against the edges of the tray she was holding, betraying a slight nervousness despite her composed tone. The man nodded, leaning forward with interest. "You've clearly never lost your touch," he said. "It's amazing how naturally it comes back. You could have been a professional, I think." There was no sarcasm in his words, only genuine observation. The compliment, though simple, carried a weight that she hadn't expected. It was rare for someone to acknowledge her abilities in this way, especially someone who had initially seen her as a subject of entertainment. The guests around the room began to take notice of the ongoing exchange. Some whispered quietly, sharing their observations with companions. "Did you see her play?" one asked. "She was incredible." Others nodded, eyes wide with astonishment. There was a sense of shared wonder, a quiet acknowledgement that what had just unfolded was not ordinary. Even staff members who had been busy with orders paused for a moment, drawn to the corner of the restaurant where the piano now seemed to symbolize something more than furniture. Meanwhile, the waitress found herself drawn back to the piano. Though she hadn't planned to continue playing, there was a quiet pull, an instinctive desire to express what words could not convey. She looked toward the keys and allowed her fingers to hover above them once more. The man noticed the movement and leaned forward slightly, curiosity and anticipation evident in his posture. His friends exchanged subtle glances, recognizing the change in the room's energy. Everyone seemed to sense that something extraordinary was about to happen again. She began to play, slowly at first, letting each note resonate fully before moving to the next. The melody was simple but hauntingly beautiful, carrying a depth of emotion that seemed to surprise everyone. The sound filled the restaurant, cutting through the chatter and clinking of cutlery, creating a quiet bubble of focus around the piano. Diners turned in their seats, eyes fixed on the young woman, who now seemed to command not only the instrument but the attention of the entire room. The man who had initiated the challenge watched in silence, no longer attempting to hide his admiration. He realized that the moment he had intended as a joke had transformed into something profound. The quiet waitress, who had seemed ordinary and unassuming, had revealed a skill that transcended the expectations of everyone present. Her music carried with it a story, a subtle yet powerful message that reached beyond words. As she continued to play, the restaurant seemed to shift around her. Guests leaned in, captivated by the flow of the melody. Some closed their eyes, allowing themselves to be carried by the notes. Others exchanged looks of awe, silently acknowledging that they were witnessing something rare and beautiful. Even the staff, who were accustomed to seeing various performances and acts of talent, found themselves momentarily mesmerized. The man's friends, initially skeptical and ready to mock, now whispered among themselves, expressing admiration and disbelief. One leaned toward another and said quietly, "I didn't expect that." "At all." Another nodded, her eyes reflecting a mixture of surprise and respect. The dynamics of the evening had shifted completely. What was meant to be a source of humor had become a shared experience of appreciation and wonder. The young waitress played with increasing confidence, each note flowing naturally, without hesitation. Her movements were fluid, her expression calm, yet deeply expressive. It was clear that this was not just a casual performance. It was a reawakening of a passion she had long kept private. The piano, once a silent fixture in the restaurant, had become a vessel for her talent and emotions, and the space around her seemed to transform in response. The man who had forced her to play felt a mix of emotions he hadn't anticipated. There was embarrassment, yes, but also a growing respect for the young woman before him. He realized that his assumptions had been shallow and misplaced. The humor he had intended to derive from the situation had been replaced by genuine admiration and even a touch of humility. He leaned back slightly, taking in the scene, understanding that he had underestimated someone based solely on appearances. As the performance continued, the energy in the room shifted from curiosity to awe. Guests who had been indifferent now watched intently, their attention fully captured by the music. Some whispered softly to each other, unsure if they were allowed to interrupt or speak, while others simply sat in silence, absorbing the unexpected gift that had been placed before them. The young waitress, though aware of the attention, remained focused on the piano, letting the music guide her without fear or hesitation. Finally, after several minutes, she paused, allowing the last note to linger in the air. The restaurant was silent for a heartbeat, as if everyone were holding their breath, reluctant to break the spell. Then, slowly, a murmur of appreciation began to ripple through the room. Guests whispered compliments, staff exchanged awed glances, and even some of the man's friends smiled, acknowledging the moment's beauty without needing to speak loudly. The wealthy man cleared his throat, his voice quiet but sincere. "That was remarkable," he said. "I don't think anyone here will." The restaurant had settled back into its usual rhythm, but the quiet sense of wonder lingered in the air. Guests who had been captivated by the first performance now found themselves glancing toward the piano from time to time, as if drawn by some invisible thread. Even those who had initially been skeptical or disinterested were now intrigued, whispering among themselves about the young waitress who had transformed an ordinary evening into something extraordinary. She moved among the tables, taking orders and refilling drinks, but her mind was elsewhere. The music had awakened something in her, a deep and familiar part of herself that had long been dormant. Her hands still tingled from the earlier performance. Each note she had played seemed to have left a small imprint on her soul, a reminder of why she had loved music in the first place. The piano had always been a place of refuge, a space where she could be herself without judgment or expectation. Tonight, that private world had collided with the public one, and she had discovered that her quiet talent could command attention and admiration. Despite the attention, she felt a sense of calm, almost as if the music had shielded her from the awkwardness that had threatened to overwhelm her. At the same time, the wealthy man who had instigated the situation could not stop thinking about what he had just witnessed. He had come to the restaurant expecting to entertain himself and his friends at the expense of someone he assumed would be unskilled. Instead, he had been confronted with raw talent and grace. The smirk he had worn earlier had vanished entirely, replaced by a mixture of awe and reflection. He could feel a subtle shift in his own perspective, a quiet acknowledgement that he had underestimated people who did not immediately fit his expectations. His friends were equally affected, though they were slower to admit it. Some whispered to each other, recounting details of the performance they had found remarkable: the clarity of the notes, the subtle emotion in each phrase, the effortless way the music seemed to flow. One of them leaned back in a chair, still trying to process how a simple waitress, someone they had assumed was ordinary, could produce something so powerful. Another nodded, admitting in a low voice that they had never expected such skill. The atmosphere at the table had shifted from one of amusement to one of genuine respect. Despite the admiration she had received, the waitress felt a mixture of vulnerability and anticipation. She had revealed a part of herself that had long been private, and now the eyes of strangers, even if filled with appreciation, were on her. She had not planned to perform again, yet she found herself drawn back to the piano, her fingers itching to touch the keys. The instrument called to her in a way that was impossible to resist, as if it were inviting her to explore the music that had always lived inside her. Taking a deep breath, she approached the piano once more. This time, there was no hesitation in her steps. She sat on the bench, letting her hands hover over the keys for a moment, sensing the quiet anticipation of the room. Guests who had been watching sporadically now leaned forward, sensing that something significant was about to happen again. Even the staff paused in their duties, unable to look away from the scene unfolding in the corner of the restaurant. She began to play, this time with a more deliberate confidence. The first notes were soft, almost whispering through the room, but they carried a depth of emotion that immediately drew attention. The melody unfolded slowly, each phrase layered with subtle expression. She was no longer just performing. She was telling a story, one that transcended words and spoke directly to the hearts of those listening. The music filled the space, wrapping around diners and staff alike, creating a shared experience that was both intimate and powerful. The man at the table watched, his expression unreadable but intense. He had been expecting amusement, perhaps a brief moment of curiosity, but instead he was witnessing artistry. There was a growing sense of humility within him, a recognition that talent and passion could exist in people who did not fit the image of a professional or a celebrity. His friends, too, were captivated, their earlier laughter replaced with quiet attentiveness, each note prompting a subtle exchange of astonished glances. As she continued to play, the complexity of the piece grew. She moved seamlessly from soft, contemplative passages to more dynamic, lively sections, her fingers dancing across the keys with a precision that spoke of years of practice and dedication. The melody was not just technically impressive, it was full of feeling. Diners could sense the emotion behind each note, the joy, the longing, the quiet strength that had carried her through years of ordinary work and private dreams. The music was no longer just sound. It was an experience, a bridge connecting her inner world to everyone present. The restaurant seemed to fade away around her. Conversation stopped, cutlery lay forgotten on tables, and even the background music of the establishment was drowned out by her playing. Each note resonated in the hearts of listeners, creating a shared awareness that something extraordinary was occurring. Guests whispered to each other in hushed tones, unable to fully articulate their amazement, while others simply sat in silence, absorbing the performance with rapt attention. The piano had become a portal into a world where talent and emotion merged. Effortlessly, the young waitress herself felt a mixture of exhilaration and calm. She had expected nervousness, perhaps even embarrassment, but instead, she felt alive in a way she had not experienced in years. The attention was still there, but it no longer mattered. The music was the center, and she was merely a conduit for it. She moved fluidly from one section of the piece to another, each chord and phrase emerging naturally. There was a rhythm to her playing that seemed almost instinctual, as though her fingers remembered every detail from years of hidden practice. The man who had challenged her initially felt a mix of guilt and admiration. He had intended the evening to be a source of amusement, but he now realized that he had completely misjudged her. His smirk was gone, replaced by a quiet respect and even a touch of awe. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table, unable to look away from the remarkable display of skill and emotion before him. The friends who had accompanied him were equally affected, some nodding subtly, others leaning back in their chairs as they absorbed the impact of the performance. Even the restaurant manager, who had been occupied with other tasks, had stopped to watch. He observed the young waitress with a mix of pride and disbelief, realizing that one of his staff members had a gift that far exceeded anything he had imagined. He exchanged a glance with a colleague, silently acknowledging the rare talent that had emerged in such an unexpected setting. The moment was not just about music. It was about the recognition of hidden potential and the unexpected ways it could reveal itself. The melody continued to evolve, growing richer and more layered with each passing moment. Diners were captivated, unable to tear their eyes away from the piano. Some had started recording the performance on their phones, but even as they did, they seemed to recognize that the real experience was in the listening, in the way the music filled the room and touched their emotions. Conversations had ceased entirely, replaced by a quiet reverence that had transformed the entire space. The young waitress felt a deep sense of connection with the audience. Even though she did not know most of them, her music spoke directly to their hearts, conveying emotion and story without the need for words. She was aware of the initial skepticism in the room, of the laughter and teasing that had once defined the moment, but that energy had been completely replaced. Now there was only admiration, respect, and the shared recognition of talent that transcended expectation. The man who had forced her to play earlier found himself reflecting on his own behavior. He had underestimated her because of her appearance, her quiet demeanor, and her role as a waitress. In that moment, he realized how easily people could be misjudged, how often true skill and passion remained hidden until someone had the courage to reveal it. He felt a subtle shift within himself, a mix of humility and a newfound appreciation for the quiet strength and capability of others. Her fingers moved across the keys with a grace that seemed effortless, yet every note carried intention and feeling. The dynamics of the piece fluctuated beautifully, rising and falling, creating moments of tension and release that held the audience in rapt attention. Each phrase told a story, and the listeners felt as though they were being taken on a journey, one of emotion, reflection, and quiet wonder. Guests who had been skeptical at first now shared soft smiles and whispered admiration to one another. Some could not contain their amazement and glanced at the man and his friends, silently acknowledging the transformation in his attitude. Even the staff, who were accustomed to witnessing talent in various forms, were affected in a unique way, recognizing that this performance was extraordinary not only for its technical skill, but for the emotional depth it conveyed. Time seemed to pass differently as she played. The evening stretched into a space that felt removed from the ordinary, a brief suspension of the usual rhythm of the restaurant. Every note resonated, not only in the room, but in the hearts of those listening. She had taken what could have been a humiliating or awkward situation and turned it into something transcendent, a moment that no one present would. The restaurant had returned to its steady rhythm, but the energy in the air was different now. Guests were more attentive, their conversation softer, their eyes drifting repeatedly toward the piano in the corner. The young waitress moved through the tables with her usual calm efficiency, taking orders, clearing plates, and refilling drinks. But there was a subtle confidence in her step, a quiet grace that hadn't been there before. She had revealed her talent once, and it had transformed how everyone perceived her. There was a new awareness in the room, a sense that she was someone remarkable, and that the piano could be the gateway to more surprises. The wealthy man and his friends remained at their table, sitting slightly apart from the rest of the diners. They had been silenced by the performance, each of them replaying the music in their minds. The man, in particular, was struggling to reconcile his earlier expectations with the reality he had just witnessed. He had come intending to amuse himself, to make a joke at the waitress's expense, and yet he had been confronted with something so genuine and extraordinary that it left him feeling small in comparison. His friends were similarly affected, whispering quietly among themselves, sharing observations about the precision of her playing, the emotional depth of the piece, and the quiet confidence she had displayed. For the waitress, the attention was both exhilarating and grounding. She had spent years hiding her ability, performing only in private, away from anyone who might judge or criticize. But tonight had been different. The moment she had played the first melody, she had felt a rush of emotion, a reconnection with a part of herself that she had thought dormant. Every note had reminded her why she loved music, why it had been such a vital part of her life. And now, as she moved through the restaurant, she carried that feeling with her, even as she resumed her work. The man leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. He noticed small details he had overlooked before, the way she interacted politely with other guests, the subtle care in her movements, the quiet resilience in her demeanor. He realized that his initial impression of her had been shallow, based solely on her role as a waitress and her unassuming nature. In those brief minutes at the piano, she had revealed depth, intelligence, and skill that he had never expected. A part of him felt guilty for underestimating her, for treating the situation as a joke when it should have been approached with respect. The friends exchanged quiet remarks, still in awe. "She's incredible," one whispered. "I never imagined someone like her could play like that." Another nodded, admitting softly, "I feel like we've underestimated so many people without even realizing it." The conversation was hushed, almost reverent, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the memory of the music that had filled the room. Meanwhile, the young waitress found herself drawn back to the piano once more. It was as if the instrument itself had recognized her talent and called her to express it again. She approached slowly, her hands hovering above the keys, feeling the anticipation in the room. Guests who had been curious moments before now leaned forward, sensing that she might perform again. Even the staff paused briefly, caught in the subtle magic of the moment. As her fingers touched the keys, she began to play softly, allowing the music to build gradually. This time, the melody was richer, more intricate, reflecting the quiet joy and confidence she felt. She moved seamlessly between gentle, flowing passages and more dynamic, expressive sequences. The audience was captivated from the first note, drawn into the unfolding story that the music conveyed. Each note resonated with emotion, each phrase carrying subtle nuance that spoke directly to the hearts of those listening. The man who had instigated the earlier challenge watched in silence, no longer attempting to mask his admiration. He had expected humor and perhaps some awkwardness, but instead, he was witnessing artistry that demanded attention and respect. His friends, equally entranced, exchanged glances, their earlier amusement replaced by astonishment. The atmosphere at the table had shifted entirely, from casual banter to quiet reflection. As they absorbed the beauty and depth of the performance, the young waitress played with a fluidity and femme de jeu and precision that spoke of years of practice and dedication. Each movement of her fingers was deliberate, each note infused with feeling. The piece she had chosen for this moment seemed to tell a story of resilience and quiet strength, a narrative that resonated with everyone in the room. Diners who had been absorbed in conversation now turned their full attention to the piano, their expressions softening as the music carried them along its gentle currents. There was a transformative quality to her playing. The room itself seemed to respond to the music, the air shifting as if acknowledging the presence of something extraordinary. Guests leaned forward, captivated by the melody, while some closed their eyes to fully immerse themselves in the experience. Even those who had been skeptical at first now found themselves quietly acknowledging the talent before them, impressed not only by the technical skill, but by the emotion and soul embedded in each note. The wealthy man felt a mix of emotions he hadn't anticipated. There was awe, certainly, but also humility. He realized how easily he had misjudged the young woman, and he felt a quiet sense of regret for having attempted to turn her into a source of amusement. Yet there was also admiration deep, genuine admiration for her ability to transform a potentially humiliating situation into a moment of beauty and inspiration. He shifted in his chair, still watching her, quietly recognizing the extraordinary talent that had been revealed before him. Her friends and coworkers, who had been observing from a distance, were equally affected. Some whispered to each other, marveling at the control and expression she displayed. Others simply watched in silence, unable to articulate the mixture of emotions stirred by the music. The performance had become more than a display of technical skill. It was a testament to resilience, passion, and the quiet strength of someone who had long kept her abilities private. As she continued, the piece grew more complex, intertwining delicate passages with bold, resonant chords. Each transition was smooth, each variation purposeful. The music seemed to fill the room in waves, ebbing and flowing with emotion and intensity. Guests were drawn into the performance, some leaning closer to the piano, others closing their eyes to fully experience the sound. The atmosphere in the restaurant was charged with quiet reverence, a shared sense of witnessing something rare and beautiful. The man who had forced her to play earlier felt a subtle shift within himself. He realized that talent and brilliance often go unnoticed until given the opportunity to shine. The young waitress, who had seemed ordinary just hours before, had revealed a depth and skill that none of them had anticipated. He felt a mixture of embarrassment and respect, acknowledging that his earlier assumptions had been shallow and misguided. His friends, too, seemed to recognize the same truth, their whispers confirming that the evening had taken an unexpected turn. For the waitress, the performance was both an expression and a release. She had spent years hiding her talent, and now she felt the joy of sharing it, even with strangers. Each note was a reflection of her passion, her dedication, and the quiet strength that had carried her through ordinary days. She moved naturally across the keys, her fingers responding instinctively to the music, guided by years of experience and practice. There was no hesitation, no self-consciousness, only a deep connection to the melody and the audience who had gathered, knowingly or unknowingly, to witness it. The guests, staff, and even the wealthy man and his friends were completely absorbed. Some whispered words of praise, while others simply watched in awe. The music had created a bond among everyone in the room, a shared acknowledgement of talent and beauty. It was a reminder that extraordinary abilities often reside in the most unexpected places, waiting for the right moment to emerge. As the performance reached its climax, the melody became more expressive, with bold chords and delicate flourishes intertwining seamlessly. The young waitress's hands moved fluidly, her posture relaxed yet confident. The music told a story of growth, resilience, and quiet triumph, capturing the hearts of everyone present. Diners felt themselves drawn into the narrative, their emotions stirred by the beauty and depth of her playing. Finally, she allowed the piece to come to a gentle resolution. The last note lingered in the air, a soft echo that seemed to hang in the restaurant for several moments. Silence followed, a collective breath held in awe of the extraordinary display of skill and emotion. Then, gradually, murmurs of admiration began to ripple through the room. Guests exchanged looks, some nodding in quiet appreciation, while others whispered softly to each other, unable to find words strong enough to capture the impact of the performance. The wealthy man leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. He had expected a joke, a brief moment of amusement, but he had been given something far more profound. He realized that he had misjudged the young woman completely, and he felt a quiet sense of humility. Her talent had not only impressed him, but had also offered a subtle lesson. Never underestimate someone based on appearances alone. His friends nodded in agreement, their earlier laughter replaced by a newfound respect and admiration. The young waitress rose from the bench slowly, her hands brushing light. The energy in the restaurant had shifted in a way that could not be ignored. It was no longer just an ordinary evening of dining and conversation. Something extraordinary had happened, and it lingered in the air like a quiet, undeniable hum. The young waitress moved through the tables, taking orders and refilling drinks as she always did, yet every step carried a newfound lightness, a subtle pride she could not hide. The moment she had shared her talent at the piano had changed not only how the guests perceived her, but also how she perceived herself. The music had awakened something long buried, something she had forgotten existed amid the ordinary routines of her life. Even as she worked, she could feel the lingering curiosity in the room. Guests who had been captivated by her performance earlier now glanced toward the piano repeatedly, drawn as if by an invisible magnet. Some whispered quietly to each other, recounting the details of the performance they had witnessed. "Did you see how effortlessly she played?" one guest murmured. Another shook their head in disbelief, murmuring, "I've never heard anything like it before." The excitement was subtle but pervasive. A sense of shared admiration that spread quietly across the room got at the table of the wealthy man and his friends. The mood was noticeably different from before. The man himself sat quietly, observing her with an expression that had lost its earlier amusement. His friends were equally subdued, their earlier laughter replaced by thoughtful acknowledgment. They had expected entertainment, perhaps a brief joke at someone else's expense, and yet they had been confronted with something profound. The young waitress had not only performed with technical skill, but had expressed an emotion that touched everyone present. They were realizing now that they had been privileged witnesses to something rare, something that could not be replicated or faked, despite the attention. The waitress remained composed, carrying herself with quiet dignity. She had learned to navigate attention gracefully, understanding that her talent, though now recognized, was a part of her that she could share selectively. Yet tonight, the circumstances had left her no choice but to reveal what she had kept private for so long. Her heart still fluttered slightly as she approached the piano once more, sensing that the evening was far from over. The instrument had become a stage, a place where she could let her passion speak louder than any words ever could. Taking her seat at the bench, she let her fingers hover above the keys. The room seemed to hold its breath, guests pausing in mid-conversation, staff briefly stopping their work, all drawn by the anticipation of what was about to unfold. The wealthy man watched intently, his earlier confidence replaced by quiet curiosity and a hint of humility. He had underestimated her once, and now he waited, unsure of what would come next, but certain it would be remarkable. She began to play, softly at first, letting the music flow naturally. The melody was different from her earlier pieces, more layered, more expressive. It started with a gentle, almost hesitant series of notes, building gradually into a rich, resonant passage that filled the restaurant. Each chord seemed intentional, each phrase deliberate yet effortless. The guests leaned in, captivated by the unfolding story. Even those who had initially dismissed the performance as a fleeting novelty were now completely absorbed, realizing that what they were witnessing was not merely a display of technical skill, but an outpouring of emotion. The music seemed to create a rhythm in the room, an invisible thread that connected everyone present. Conversations faded entirely, replaced by a quiet attentiveness. Diners who had been engaged in casual chatter were now focused solely on the young waitress and the piano, their eyes following the movements of her hands as they danced across the keys. The melody was both intimate and expansive, touching hearts without needing words, speaking to something universal in everyone who listened. The wealthy man could feel his perspective shifting. He had arrived at the restaurant expecting amusement, perhaps even a moment of superiority, and yet he found himself humbled. The young waitress, who had seemed ordinary and unassuming, had revealed a depth and capability that he had not imagined. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table, watching every movement, absorbing every note. There was no room for arrogance now, no space for dismissiveness. The music demanded respect and attention, and he felt compelled to offer both. Her friends and coworkers, observing from a distance, were equally struck. Whispers of admiration traveled quietly through the restaurant. "She's amazing," one said. Another shook their head in disbelief. "I had no idea she could play like that." Even staff members who had been familiar with her work were surprised at the depth of her skill and the emotion she poured into the music. It was clear that this was no ordinary performance. It was a moment of revelation, a demonstration of talent and passion that transcended expectation. As she continued, the music grew more intricate, intertwining delicate, flowing passages with bold, resonant chords. Each variation was precise, yet full of feeling. She was no longer merely performing. She was communicating. The piano had become a voice for her inner world, expressing emotions and stories that words could never capture. Diners felt themselves swept along by the melodies, their hearts engaged in ways they had not anticipated. Some closed their eyes, allowing themselves to be carried by the music, while others watched in awe, unable to look away from the mastery displayed before them. The wealthy man and his friends exchanged glances, acknowledging silently the transformation in the room. The earlier amusement, the expectation of a joke, had vanished entirely. They were witnessing talent and passion that demanded recognition. Each chord, each phrase, each subtle nuance of the performance conveyed a depth of emotion that made it impossible to remain indifferent. It was a humbling experience, a reminder that appearances could be deceiving and that extraordinary abilities often reside in the most unexpected people. For the waitress, the performance was both a continuation and an expansion of what she had revealed earlier. She felt a growing sense of freedom as she played, a release of emotions that had long been contained. Each note was an expression of herself, of her dedication to music, and the quiet strength that had carried her through ordinary days. She moved with a fluidity and confidence that seemed almost effortless, her fingers navigating the keys with precision and grace. Yet despite the technical mastery, there was warmth and humanity in every note, a reminder that music was not merely skill, but feeling and connection. The restaurant had become transformed. It was no longer just a place to eat. It had become a space for shared experience, for quiet reflection, for admiration and wonder. The piano, once merely an object in the corner, had become a bridge between the performer and everyone present. The music created a sense of unity, a common thread linking guests, staff, and even the wealthy man and his friends in appreciation and awe. The wealthy man felt a subtle shift in himself as he listened. He had arrived seeking amusement and perhaps a sense of superiority, but he had been confronted with something far more profound. The young waitress had revealed not just skill but heart, not just technique but soul. He felt a quiet humility, a recognition that his assumptions had been shallow and misguided. Her performance was a reminder that talent often lies hidden, waiting for the right moment to emerge, and that true brilliance could not be measured by appearances alone. Her coworkers and friends, who had been observing silently, were equally affected. Some whispered quietly among themselves, sharing their amazement. Others simply watched in awe, unable to find the words to capture the depth and beauty of the performance. The music had created a rare moment of shared human experience, a recognition of skill, emotion, and resilience that transcended ordinary conversation. As the piece continued, the melody grew more dynamic, weaving intricate patterns with delicate, expressive flourishes. Her fingers moved with confidence and grace, each note carrying emotion and intention. The audience was completely absorbed. Diners leaned forward, staff paused in their work, and even the wealthy man and his friends remained silent, captivated by the performance. There was a sense of reverence in the room, a collective acknowledgement that what was happening was extraordinary. Finally, after several minutes of flowing, expressive music, she allowed the piece to come to a gentle resolution. The final chord lingered, soft and resonant, filling the space with a quiet echo. For a brief moment, there was silence, as though the entire restaurant collectively held its breath, unwilling to break the spell. Then murmurs of admiration began to ripple through the room. Guests whispered compliments, staff exchanged astonished glances, and even the wealthy man and his friends nodded in quiet recognition of the rare talent they had witnessed. The young waitress rose from the piano bench slowly, her hands brushing lightly over the keys as she returned to her duties. There was a subtle glow of pride on her face, a reflection of the joy and satisfaction she felt in having shared her hidden talent. She had turned what could have been a humiliating situation into a moment of beauty and inspiration. The experience had not only impressed those around her, but had also reaffirmed her own sense of worth and capability. The piano, once a decorative object in the corner of the restaurant, had become a stage for brilliance. It had revealed the evening was nearing its end, yet the atmosphere in the restaurant remained charged with an energy that refused to fade. Guests were lingering at their tables, not out of impatience, but out of fascination. The young waitress had left an impression so deep that it seemed impossible for anyone to return entirely to the ordinary routines of their evening. Even the soft clinking of glasses and the quiet murmur of conversation felt different now, tempered by the memory of the music and the story it had told. The piano sat quietly in the corner, its presence almost symbolic, as if it had witnessed the unfolding of something rare and unforgettable. For the young waitress, the night had been transformative. Each interaction, each glance of admiration, had reinforced a sense of belonging and recognition that she had never fully experienced before. Her work had always been routine, defined by tasks and duties that demanded efficiency, but not attention or respect beyond a simple thank you. Tonight had been different. She had revealed a part of herself that had long remained hidden, and in doing so, had not only captured the admiration of the room, but had also rediscovered her own sense of purpose and pride as she moved through the restaurant. Clearing plates and checking on tables, she noticed subtle changes in the guests' demeanor. Their eyes followed her, but not with expectation or judgment, rather with curiosity, admiration, and genuine respect. Some whispered quietly to one another, recounting what they had witnessed at the piano, while others simply watched, captivated by her calm presence and graceful movements. Even those who had not been present for the performance earlier seemed affected by the atmosphere she had created. There was a quiet acknowledgement in the room that something extraordinary had occurred, and it had left an indelible mark on everyone at the table of the wealthy man and his friends. The mood was one of quiet reflection. The man himself sat back in his chair, his hands folded in front of him, his eyes fixed on the young waitress as she moved with unassuming confidence. His friends had long since abandoned the teasing and amusement that had characterized the evening's beginning. Instead, they were engaged in whispered conversation, commenting on the depth of her talent, the fluidity of her playing, and the unmistakable emotional resonance in each note. They were learning a lesson in humility and respect, realizing that true skill often lies hidden, waiting for a chance to emerge. The wealthy man's thoughts were conflicted. He felt embarrassment for underestimating her, pride for having witnessed something remarkable, and curiosity about the person who had displayed such extraordinary ability. He realized that his initial assumption that the situation would be humorous had been completely misguided. He had intended to provoke laughter, perhaps even discomfort, but instead he had encountered talent and emotion that had transformed not just his perception of the young waitress, but also his understanding of what it meant to recognize and appreciate brilliance in others. The young waitress approached the piano once more, sensing that the evening had not yet concluded. It was a quiet pull, almost instinctual, a gentle urge to express herself fully one last time before the night came to a close. She had already played twice, but this time felt different. It was a moment not for proving herself or impressing others, but for sharing the music that lived in her, the melodies that had been her companions through years of ordinary work and quiet ambition. Her fingers hovered over the keys, and she could feel the anticipation in the room. A subtle shift as guests and staff alike paused, sensing that something profound was about to unfold again. The first notes were soft, almost hesitant, yet they carried a quiet strength. The melody unfolded gradually, each chord flowing naturally into the next. It was not a demonstration of technical skill alone. It was storytelling, a communication of emotion and experience that words could not convey. The guests listened intently, some leaning forward, some closing their eyes, allowing the music to envelop them entirely. The restaurant had become a space of shared experience, a place where emotion, talent, and humanity converged. The wealthy man watched, captivated. He had expected humor, perhaps even a moment of awkwardness, and instead he found himself witnessing something deeply moving. His friends were equally entranced, some exchanging subtle glances, others quietly whispering their admiration. The music had transformed the evening, creating an atmosphere of reverence and awe that transcended the ordinary expectations of a restaurant visit. Each note played by the young waitress seemed to carry layers of her personality, her experiences, her quiet resilience, and the strength of her dedication to music. As she continued, the melody grew more intricate, weaving delicate passages with bold, resonant chords. Her fingers moved with effortless grace, each motion intentional yet natural. The performance was no longer about drawing attention or impressing anyone. It was about connection, about allowing the music to speak freely and touch the hearts of everyone present. Diners were completely absorbed, captivated by the subtle power of each note and the way it transformed the atmosphere of the room. The wealthy man reflected on his earlier behavior, realizing how easily he had misjudged someone based on appearance and circumstance. He had expected simplicity, perhaps even mediocrity, and instead he had been confronted with extraordinary talent. The lesson was quiet but profound. Brilliance often resides in unexpected places, and recognition should not be limited by assumptions. He felt a mixture of humility and admiration, acknowledging that the young waitress had not only exceeded expectations, but had also conveyed a depth of character and poise that was rare and remarkable. Her coworkers and friends, observing from a distance, were equally affected. They had witnessed the transformation of a simple act into something extraordinary, the emergence of hidden talent in an ordinary setting. Their whispers carried astonishment and pride, a shared acknowledgement that they were witnessing a once-in-a-lifetime moment. Even the staff who were unfamiliar with her musical abilities were drawn into the experience, captivated by the skill, emotion, and authenticity she projected through the piano. The young waitress herself felt a sense of liberation and fulfillment. She had spent years containing her talent, unsure how it would be received or if it was worth sharing. Now, she had experienced not only recognition, but genuine admiration. Each note she played resonated with emotion. Each phrase communicated her story, her passion, and her quiet determination. She moved fluidly across the keys, lost in the music yet aware of the presence of everyone in the room. It was a rare moment of harmony, where effortlessness met expression, and talent met opportunity. The melody swelled, reaching a crescendo that filled every corner of the restaurant. The power of the music was not just in its sound, but in the emotions it evoked. Diners leaned forward, completely absorbed, and even the staff paused in their duties to take in the performance. The wealthy man and his friends watched in quiet awe, fully engaged as the music unfolded like a story, revealing layers of feeling, experience, and artistry. It was a performance that transcended expectations. A reminder that talent could not be judged by appearance or circumstance alone. As the piece drew to a close, she allowed the final notes to linger in the air, soft and resonant. There was a moment of silence, a collective breath held as everyone absorbed the significance of what they had witnessed. Then, slowly, a ripple of appreciation spread through the room. Guests whispered compliments, some stood quietly applauding, and the staff exchanged glances of admiration. Even the wealthy man and his friends, who had begun the evening with amusement and perhaps condescension, nodded in genuine respect. Acknowledging the rare talent they had been fortunate to witness, the young waitress rose from the piano bench, her hands brushing lightly over the keys. There was a quiet pride in her expression, a subtle glow that reflected both satisfaction and humility. She had turned what could have been a humiliating moment into a transformative experience, not only for herself, but for everyone who had been present. The restaurant had been changed by her performance, the guests had been touched by her talent, and the wealthy man had learned an unspoken lesson about the power of humility, respect, and recognition, even after the music had stopped. The resonance of her performance lingered. The atmosphere remained altered, infused with a sense of wonder and admiration. Conversations resumed, but they were quieter, more thoughtful, carrying traces of the emotions stirred by the music. Guests would leave that night with memories of an extraordinary performance, a story to recount to friends and family, and a reminder that brilliance often resides where it is least expected. The wealthy man remained, seated for a few moments longer, reflecting on the evening. He had expected humor, entertainment at someone else's expense, and perhaps a fleeting sense of superiority. Instead, he had been humbled and inspired. He recognized the quiet strength and talent of the young waitress, her ability to transform a simple challenge into a moment of beauty and human connection. He understood, in that quiet reflection, that true greatness often reveals itself in unexpected ways, and that respect and admiration should always follow talent. Regardless of its origin, the young waitress continued her work, moving among the tables with grace and composure. She smiled politely at guests, answered questions,